Welcome back to Sleep Store. Imagine for a moment that you could hear a melody played 30,000 years ago. Not a recording, not a reconstruction, but the actual notes that drifted through fire-lit air when the world was buried under ice and humanity was still figuring out what it even meant to be human. What would that sound tell you about the mind that created it? What would it mean if that mind, that ancient prehistoric mind, living in caves and hunting mammoths, sat down one day and decided that survival wasn't enough, that something in them needed music? Because here's the thing, for a long time, the story we told ourselves about early humans was pretty simple. They were tough. Sure, they were clever enough to chip stone and track animals and light fires. But art, music, the inner life that drives someone to pick up an instrument and play, that was supposed to come later. That was supposed to be the product of a more developed brain, a more complex society, something closer to us and further from the wild. Then someone pulled a small carved bone out of a cave in southwestern Germany, and that story collapsed completely. The object is barely the length of your hand. It has holes drilled into it with a precision that is honestly uncomfortable to think about, given the tools available at the time. And when researchers analyzed it, the dates came back at somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 years old, depending on the method and the layer it came from. 30,000 years. To put that in perspective, the Egyptian pyramids are about 4,000 years old. The Roman Empire peaked roughly 2,000 years ago. This flute was already ancient beyond imagining before any of that existed. And it isn't alone. There are others. Flutes carved from mammoth ivory, flutes shaped from vulture bone, found across sites in the same region, all clustered in that same remarkable window of time. A moment in prehistory, when something was clearly happening, when the people living through the last great ice age were doing things we didn't expect them to do, making things we didn't think they were capable of making, leaving behind evidence of an inner world so rich, it forces us to completely rethink what early human minds were like. That's what this story is really about. Not just a flute, not just a curiosity sitting in a glass case in a museum. It's about what that object proves, the planning required to make it, the abstract thinking behind it, the cultural meaning it must have carried, and the deeply uncomfortable question it raises about where exactly the line between us and them actually sits, if it sits anywhere at all. Over the course of this video, we're going to go through all of it: how the flute was discovered and where it was found, how scientists dated it, and why those dates hold up under serious scrutiny, why the materials it was made from matter more than you might think, whether it actually functions as a real instrument, or whether that's just wishful interpretation, what it would have sounded like, and ultimately, what it asks us to rethink about cognition, creativity, and the ancient roots of what makes us human. It's a lot to get through, and honestly, every section of this goes somewhere surprising. So, if this is the kind of thing you find yourself falling asleep to, welcome. You're in the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is there. I genuinely read through those, and every time, it's the same thing. Someone in Tokyo at midnight. Someone in Toronto at 2 o'clock in the morning. Someone in Cape Town just waking up. It never gets old. So tell me where you are, and if you want to hear this without any ads, and without any background music getting in the way of the narration, you can follow the channel on Spotify. It's completely free to follow. It plays ad-free. There's no music layered underneath, just the voice and the story. The link is in the description, and it genuinely is the best way to support what we'll sell. Don't want to spend anything. Now, back to that bone, back to that cave, back to a moment 30,000 years ago, when someone somewhere in Ice Age Europe made a decision that tells us something profound about the human mind, about what we are, about what we have always been, even when we were cold and hungry, and surrounded by a world trying very hard to kill us. Let's find out what they made, and why it matters so much that they made it at all. The caves that gave us these instruments are not randomly chosen locations. They sit in a region of southwestern Germany called the Suabian Jura, a limestone plateau that runs roughly 100 kilometers through what is now Baden-Württemberg. The names of the specific sites have become quite famous in archaeological circles: Hullfels, Gasse, Cloella, Voglerherd, Holstein. These are not dramatic cliffs or vast cathedral caverns. They are modest, tucked into valley walls, the kind of place you could walk past without noticing if you didn't know what you were looking for. But they have one property that turned out to be extraordinarily valuable across 30,000 years of waiting. They are cold, they are dry, and they are stable. Caves preserve things that the open air destroys. Bone degrades fast when it's exposed to cycles of wet and dry, heat and cold, the attention of scavengers and roots and soil microbes. Put that same bone inside a limestone cave where the temperature barely fluctuates and the sediment layers build up slowly and undisturbed, and suddenly you have a time capsule. The organic material doesn't vanish. It just sits there, slowly getting buried, slowly getting compressed, waiting. The Swabian Jura caves have been doing this for tens of thousands of years, accumulating layers of sediment the way a tree accumulates rings, each one a chapter, each one datable if you know how to read it. And that's where stratigraphy comes in, because this is something that doesn't get explained enough when people talk about archaeological finds. It isn't just about what you find, it's about where you find it and what surrounds it. Stratigraphy is essentially the science of layers. Sediment builds up over time, newer material on top, older material below. When archaeologists excavate a site carefully, they're reading those layers the way you'd read pages in a book, except the pages are compacted earth and ash and animal bone, and occasionally something extraordinary. The position of an artifact within those layers tells you roughly when it was deposited. Find a flute fragment in a layer that also contains the bones of animals known from a specific period, alongside tools associated with a specific cultural tradition. And you have a context, not just a date, but a whole picture of what was happening when that object was placed in the ground, or more accurately, when it was dropped and left there, and slowly covered over by the passage of time. The cultural layer that matters here is called the Aurignacian. It's a technological and cultural tradition associated with anatomically modern humans arriving in Europe, dated broadly to between roughly 43,000 and 30,000 years ago. When archaeologists find objects in Aurigny layers, they know they are looking at the work of our direct ancestors, the first modern humans to move through Ice Age Europe, the people who also left behind the earliest known cave paintings and carved figurines. The flutes from the Swabian Jura come from these layers. That's not incidental. That's the entire argument. The context is the evidence. Now, here's where the popular image of archaeology really diverges from the reality, because the story people imagine is always the same. Researcher brushing away dirt, object emerging pristine and complete. A gasp of recognition, roll credits. That is not how this works. The flutes from Holyfels and Guise close to were not pulled from the earth whole. They came out in pieces, fragments, small curved sections of bone or ivory that individually looked like almost nothing. The vulture bone flute from Holyfels came out in 12 separate fragments, scattered across the earth, sediment of a single excavation layer. The researchers had to collect those pieces over multiple field seasons, clean them, analyze them, and eventually fit them back together like a three-dimensional puzzle, where several pieces are still missing, and the box has no picture on it. This matters enormously, because it changes the nature of the question. When you pull a complete, obviously manufactured object out of the ground, the interpretation almost makes itself, but when you're working with fragments, you have to earn every conclusion. You have to ask whether the pieces actually belong together, whether the holes you're seeing are deliberate, or the result of ancient damage, whether the object was deposited here intentionally, or washed in from somewhere else, whether the layer you found it in has been disturbed by later digging, animal burrowing, or root intrusion. Every one of those questions has to be answered before you can say anything with confidence about what you have. The excavation context at these sites included much more than just the flutes themselves. The same layers contained thousands of animal bones, primarily horse, ibex, reindeer, mammoth, and cave bear, telling researchers about the diet and hunting practices of the people who lived there. They found stone tools, particularly the distinctive blade technologies of the Orinosan, which require a specific and quite sophisticated understanding of how stone fractures. They found charcoal from hearths, ochre, the red mineral pigment that early humans used for everything from body decoration to preserving hides, beads made from shells and ivory, some brought from sources hundreds of kilometers away, small carved figurines, including the famous Lion Man and the Venus of Holy Fells, among the oldest known representational sculptures in the world. These weren't isolated campsites. These were places where people lived and worked and gathered and apparently made music. The fauna tells you something specific and important. Many of the bones in these layers come from animals that would have been hunted in open grassland or at the forest edge. The presence of particular species in particular ratios helps researchers understand what season or seasons the caves were occupied, since different animals move through different areas at different times of year. Some of the Surbianura caves appear to have been used repeatedly, not as permanent homes, but as seasonal stopping points, which raises its own interesting questions about the social world. These people inhabited. Who came back to these caves? Were they the same groups returning along established migration routes? Were the flutes left behind, or carried from place to place? And then there's the question that haunts every interpretation of fragments, accident, or artifact. This is not a trivial distinction. Bones get broken in all kinds of ways. Carnivores gnaw them. They get trampled. Freeze-thaw cycles crack them along natural fault lines. Even the pressure of overlying sediment can produce fractures that look almost deliberate. So when you find a curved section of bone with what appears to be a series of evenly spaced holes drilled through it, you have to rule out every non-human explanation before you can claim human manufacture. Could those holes be the result of carnivore tooth marks? Are they spaced too evenly for chance? Is the surface worked, smoothed, shaped in ways that natural processes don't produce? These are the questions that take years to answer, that require microscopic analysis and experimental archaeology and peer review and debate. The researchers working on these flutes did all of that work, and what they found, when they looked closely enough, was a pattern of deliberate manufacture that is genuinely difficult to explain any other way. The holes are not random. The bones were selected for specific properties: thin walls, a particular diameter, a hollow interior that would allow air to vibrate in predictable ways. In the case of the mammoth ivory flutes, the material itself was split, hollowed, shaped, and then rejoined with a precision that required planning well beyond the moment of making. So the cave is not just a backdrop. The layers are not just context. The fragments are not just debris. All of it together builds the case, each piece supporting the others, each detail narrowing down the range of possible explanations until you'd left with something that is genuinely hard to argue against. Someone was here, someone made this, someone who had the same basic cognitive architecture you're using right now to follow this argument sat in a cold cave 30,000 years ago and made a decision that has echoed forward across every generation since. The question that follows naturally is, how do we actually know how old it is? Because that number, 30,000 years, that's doing a lot of work in this story, and it deserves more than just acceptance. It deserves scrutiny. To start with, nobody walks into a cave, pulls out a bone with holes in it, squints, and goes, "Yeah, this feels like 38,000 years." That's not how this works. The age is not a vibe. It's a measurement. Or rather, it's many different measurements, stitched together into a story that is always provisional, always open to revision when better data comes along. The first tool in that kit the one you probably heard of, is radiocarbon dating, carbon-14. This is the workhorse of late Ice Age archaeology, and it has a very particular sweet spot. Every living thing on Earth is soaking up tiny amounts of radioactive carbon from the atmosphere. Plants take it in through photosynthesis. Animals eat the plants. You eat the animals and the plants. As long as something is alive, it's part of this exchange, constantly refreshing its carbon. When it dies, that exchange stops. No more new carbon-14 comes in. The carbon-14 that's already in the tissues begins to decay at a known rate. Over time, the ratio of radioactive carbon to stable carbon changes in a way we can measure. That's the whole idea. Measure the ratio, do the math, get an age since death. But there are catches. There are always catches. First, you need organic material: bone, charcoal, shell, bits of hide, plant remains. If you're lucky, you can scrape a tiny amount directly from the object you care about, say collagen from the flute bone itself. If you're less lucky, or if you don't want to destroy any more of a rare artifact than you absolutely have to, you date the things around it. Charcoal from the hearth in the same layer, bone from an animal clearly associated with the same occupation. Second, radiocarbon doesn't give you calendar years. It gives you radiocarbon years which are based on the assumption that the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has always been constant. It hasn't. Solar activity, Earth's magnetic field, even human activity in the last few centuries, all change the background levels of carbon-14. So when you hear a date, like 35,000 radiocarbon years before present, that's not a direct 35,000 years ago on your calendar. It's a raw number. To translate it into something like 38,000 to 40,000 calendar years ago, you have to calibrate it. Calibration is where things get both more accurate and more confusing. Researchers compare radiocarbon dates against independent records that preserve a year-by-year timeline. Tree rings, Greenland ice cores, corals, lake sediments. These records capture past fluctuations in atmospheric carbon-14 by aligning radiocarbon measurements with those other archives. You build a calibration curve, basically a lookup table that says, if your sample returns this many radiocarbon years, it most likely corresponds to this range of actual years. Notice the word range. Calibration doesn't collapse uncertainty. It often expands it. That 35,000 radiocarbon years might turn into something like 39,500 to 41,000 calendar years ago, with a highest probability around 40,000. So when you see a paper that says CAR 40,000 years ago, there's statistical machinery hiding behind that little car. It stands for circa, around, give or take. It's a signal that we're talking about bands of probability, not a timestamp. Now tie that back to the flutes at Geese and Close. Several of the musical instruments come from some of the deepest Aurignacian layers. Those layers also contain a lot of charcoal, bone, and other organic material that can be radiocarbonated. Labs take multiple samples from different bits of the same layer and from the layers just above and below, then run them independently. The dates cluster after calibration. They form a window, something like about 42,000 to 43,000 calendar years ago. That becomes the estimated age of the layer, and by extension, of everything securely embedded in that layer: the tools, the animal bones, the beads, and yes, the flute fragments. But context matters as much as chemistry. Radiocarbon dates don't float in a vacuum. They'd anchored to stratigraphy and to what archaeologists call culture historical frameworks. That's where the ornation comes back in. Remember those distinctive stone blade technologies, the carved figurines, the specific ways of shaping bone and ivory. Together, they define a tool industry, a package of habits and techniques that tends to show up in a specific time slice across multiple sites. When you find an assemblage that fits this pattern, the right kinds of blades, the right kinds of cores, certain bone tools, particular ornaments, and when radiocarbon dates from that layer fall in the expected window for Oronian occupation, you don't just have a number, you have a cultural context. So for the Suabianura, the argument looks something like this. The flute fragments are found in well-defined Orinian layers. Those layers contain stone tools that match Orion forms found in France, Austria, maybe as far as Spain. Radioarban dates on charcoal and bone from those same layers when calibrated fall between roughly 43 and 35,000 years ago. Other sites across Europe with similar Oronian toolkits and radiocarbon signatures support that general time range. Put all of that together, and you can say with some confidence, these flutes belong to the early Oronasian period, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 calendar years ago. Give or take a few thousand. Give or take a few thousand might sound sloppy until you remember the scale. If you're talking about events in your own life, a few thousand years is infinity. If you're talking about the Pleistocene, it's a pretty tight bracket. Archaeologists are thrilled when a date can be pinned down to within a millennium or two, and they're careful because they know how many ways this can go wrong. Radioarban dates can be skewed by contamination. A tiny amount of more recent carbon introduced by groundwater, root activity, conservation materials, or even the breath and sweat of excavators can make an ancient sample look deceptively young. The opposite can happen too. For example, if you accidentally date old wood that was already lying around for centuries before people burned it in a hearth, layers can be mixed. Burrowing animals, tree roots, freeze-thaw cycles, even the repeated digging and trampling of ancient humans themselves can move objects up or down in the sediment. A flute fragment that looks like it's part of an early oration level might actually have migrated downward from a slightly younger occupation or upward from an older one. Because of this, you'll notice the language archaeologists use is hedged. They say, associated with Oroniation levels, most likely dates to the early phase, appears to predate minimum age terminus ante-m, the last phrase meaning it must be older than X, because it was already in place when X happened. You rarely see a claim like this, Flute was made in 38,262 BCE. If you do, you should be suspicious. Instead, the argument builds layer by layer, site by site. Flutes in Suabianura or in Yassian contexts, more possible flutes or pierced bones in sites in France and Eastern Europe, some clearly younger, some in borderline contexts. Radioarban dates at each site, all independently calibrated, all producing overlapping windows. When multiple sites with similar technologies and similar toolkits cluster in time within a region, you start to see the outline of a broader timeline. When modern humans arrived, when certain artistic traditions emerged, when they seemed to disappear or transform. This is why new dates can cause such a stir. When researchers redated some of the Gase and cluster layers with more refined techniques, pushing parts of the Ornation there slightly earlier than previously thought, it didn't just shift the birthday of one flute, it nudged the whole narrative of when symbolic behavior and figurative art appeared in Europe. Every recalibration of the carbon curve, every remeasurement of a key layer, has the potential to move our mental timeline by hundreds or even thousands of years. So when you hear a flute about 40,000 years old, what you're actually hearing is the summary of a huge amount of work. Radiocarbon labs running carefully cleaned samples, statisticians generating probability distributions, excavation teams documenting stratigraphy centimeter by centimeter, typologists comparing tool forms across continents, and then everyone sitting down together to say cautiously, given everything we know right now, this is the most reasonable window. And that's important to keep in mind, because the next question is not just how old is it, but what? Does an object that old, and that carefully dated, actually tell us about the people who made it? To get there, we have to look at the material itself, the bone, the ivory, the deliberate choice to turn the remains of animals into sound. If you were one of those Orinian toolmakers standing in that cave, your first decision wouldn't be, What song do I play? It would be, what do I make this thing out of? Paleolithic flutes, at least the ones we found so far, mostly answer that question in three ways: bird bone, mammal bone, and mammoth ivory. Each one carries its own physics, its own logistics, its own story about the people who picked it up. Start with the simplest bird bone. Some birds, especially large ones like swans, griffon vultures, or geese, come with a hidden gift for instrument makers. Their long wing bones are hollow tubes. Evolution did that to save weight for flight. But if you're a human with a sharp stone and a lot of patience, evolution has also just handed you a pre-made resonating chamber. A hollow bird bone is basically a natural flute body waiting to happen. It already has a continuous internal cavity. The walls are thin enough that you can pierce them from the outside without needing metal drills. The cross-section is predictable, fairly round, so air flows through it in a stable way. And because the bone is pneumatic, full of air spaces instead of dense marrow, it can vibrate and resonate more freely when you blow across it. From a purely practical standpoint, this is the path of least resistance. You don't have to hollow anything out. You don't have to split and re-glue. You don't have to wrestle with a big slab of material that wants to crack in the wrong direction. You just have to clean it, trim it, shape the ends, and then make your decisions about where to put the holes. But simple doesn't mean trivial. You need to know which part of the bird's skeleton will give you the right length and diameter. You need to be able to strip away flesh and tendons without shattering a very delicate tube. And you have to understand, even if only by trial and error and cultural memory, how the thickness of those walls will interact with the holes you're about to punch into them. Some bones work better than others. A very small songbird's bone might be too narrow for much volume. A huge bird might give you something longer with a lower pitch. Over time, you can imagine knowledge accumulating. Use the wing bone from that kind of vulture, not the leg bone from that other species. This one sings, that one doesn't. Now, zoom out to bigger animals. Mammal bones from reindeer, horses, bears can also be turned into flutes, but they tend to be denser. Long bones of mammals are full of marrow. Instead of a ready-made tube, you often get a thick shaft with just a narrow internal canal. To make that into a flute, you either need to work from the outside in, carefully opening up that canal, or you select bones where nature has done more of the hollowing for you, like certain parts of the forelimb. Using mammal bone changes the equation. Thicker walls mean different resonance properties. A heavy bone will damp some vibrations, but can also give a richer, more stable tone once you coax sound out of it. It's likely harder to carve clean holes without cracking. That suggests more planning, more experimentation, and a longer tradition of transmitted know-how. People who've broken enough pieces to figure out what not to do. And then there's the show-off material, mammoth ivory. When archaeologists say ivory flute, they not talking about picking up a convenient hollow tusk-shaped tube and poking a few holes. Mammoth tusks are solid dentine, no central channel. To turn that into a flute, you're signing up for serious work. The usual reconstruction goes something like this. You take a section of tusk and split it lengthwise into 2 or more pieces. Each piece has to be thinned and shaped. You carve out matching grooves to create the internal bore, making sure the curvature and diameter are consistent along the whole length. Then you join the halves back together, probably with some kind of adhesive, like birch tar, and bindings of sinew or plant fiber. And only then do you start worrying about the finger holes and mouthpiece. Every step is an opportunity to ruin days or weeks of labor. Split the ivory poorly and it shatters. Carve the groove off-center and your 2 halves don't match, leaving gaps that leak air. Botch the glue or binding and the seam opens under pressure. Add to that the fact that ivory behaves differently than bone when you work it. It's tough, but also prone to long, catastrophic cracks if stressed in the wrong direction. You have to understand its grain, its tendency to warp as it dries, how it reacts to heat. In other words, an ivory flute might embody not just an hour of tinkering by one person, but the wallet, accumulated craft of a community that has learned through painful trial and error how to dissuade a mammoth tusk to become a musical instrument. All of this assumes, of course, that you even have access to these materials. You don't get griffin vulture wing bones without griffin vultures. You don't get mammoth ivory without mammoths. That means hunting, scavenging, or trade. It means somebody killed or found a very large animal, processed its carcass, and then someone else, maybe the same people, maybe allied groups, selected certain parts not just for food or tools, but specifically for sound. To consistently make flutes from the same kinds of bird bones, you need more than a random encounter with a dead bird. You need people who know the animal's anatomy well enough to say, this part here from shoulder to elbow gives us the best tubes. That implies repeated carcass processing, anatomical knowledge, and a mental map of the skeleton that goes beyond where is the meat into where is the material with the properties I want. Mammoth ivory raises the stakes even higher. Tusks are massive, heavy, and awkward to move. You might retrieve them from natural deaths, from scavenging frozen carcasses, or from active hunts. In any case, once a tusk is in your camp, it's a high-value resource. You can turn it into spear points, figurines, prestige objects, or you can commit part of it to a flute that does not feed anyone and does not pierce any hides. That choice tells us something. In a world where every calorie is work, deciding to sacrifice a piece of prime ivory to music is an economic decision, not an accident. It suggests that sound, ritual, identity, whatever music was doing for these people was important enough to justify burning through a piece of their best raw material. Material choice also reflects what they wanted from the finished instrument. Bird bone flutes are naturally lighter and more portable. They're small enough to tuck into a pouch or hang from a cord. They might be more fragile, but easy to replace if you live in an ecosystem with plenty of birds. They probably favor a certain bright, penetrating tone you can carry over background noise, useful around fires, in caves, or out on the tundra. Ivory, by contrast, is durable. Once you get past the manufacturing nightmare, you end up with something robust, moisture-resistant, less likely to warp or splinter. It might produce a warmer or more powerful sound, depending on the internal bore and wall thickness. It feels different in the hand, heavy, cool, substantial. That weight and permanence might have mattered in ways that weren't just acoustic. An ivory flute could be a status object, an heirloom, a thing tied to particular ceremonies or particular people. Mammal bone instruments might sit somewhere between the two, sturdier than bird bone, easier to obtain than ivory, with their own characteristic timbre. Choosing one over the other isn't just about what's available, it's about aesthetics, expectations, and tradition. If you grew up in a group where real ritual music is always played on ivory flutes, then a bird bone whistle isn't just a different material, it's a different category of object, and that's the deeper point. These are not random scraps of animal left over from dinner. They're the result of a chain of decisions: which animals to hunt or recover, which body parts to save, which materials to reserve for tools, weapons, art, and which to invest in instruments that produce nothing you can eat or wear. When you hold one of these ancient flutes in a museum case today, you're not just looking at bone or ivory shaped by stone. You're looking at a choice, repeated over generations, to turn the bodies of other animals into organized sound. A choice that says, in between survival tasks in the cold and danger of Ice Age Europe, some people still thought it was worth the effort to make music, and they were picky about what they made it from. And once you see that, another question appears. How do we know these bones and tusks really were turned into instruments on purpose and not just cracked and chewed by time and teeth? To answer that, we have to zoom in on the evidence written in the holes themselves. If you pick up a random fragment of ancient bone, it will almost always be damaged. Weathering, trampling, freezing, and thawing, roots, bacteria, fire. The past is not gentle on calcium. Add carnivores to the mix, and things get even messier. Hyenas, wolves, big cats, all love bones. They crack them for marrow, chew them into splinters, leave behind punctures and ragged edges. So when archaeologists claim this isn't just a chewed bone, it's a flute, they're making a big statement, and the burden of proof is heavy. The way they meet that burden is by treating the bone like a crime scene. Every surface is a clue. Every edge, every scratch, every hole has to answer the same question. Could this really have happened by accident? Start with the holes themselves. Random damage does not tend to line things up neatly. Carnivore teeth come in arcs, not rulers. When a hyena bites through a shaft, you get irregular punctures offset from each other, following the curve of the jaw. When a bone snaps from pressure or trampling, cracks run along planes of weakness in the material, not in tidy rows along the axis. Flute candidates look different. On the most convincing Aurinian flutes, the holes sit in a straight line along the length of the bone or ivory tube, not spiraling around it or clustering at one end. The spacing between them is not just approximately equal. In some cases, it's astonishingly regular. You can measure the center-to-center distance and find the same value repeated within a millimeter or two from one hole to the next. That's the first diagnostic layout, a pattern that looks more like a ruler than a bite mark. Then there's the shape of each opening. Carnivore punctures tend to be more conical, crushed inward with bones splintered and pushed into the cavity. The edges are jagged, chipped, with tiny flakes radiating out from the point of impact. If the tooth dragged, you see a tear or gouge leading away from the hole. In a human-made hole, the edges tell a different story. The openings are often closer to circular or consistently oval with margins that have been thinned and smoothed. On some flutes, you can see that the rim of the hole has been beveled, shaved down at an angle. So, the transition from surface to opening is gradual instead of abrupt. The bevel isn't decoration. It changes how air flows under your fingers and affects the ease of playing. But from the archaeologist point of view, it's also a smoking gun. Wild animals do not bevel bone edges for acoustic properties. Look even closer, and the cut marks start to appear. Under a hand lens, and especially under a microscope, stone tools and teeth leave very different signatures. A sharp flint blade produces V-shaped grooves with straight, well-defined walls and, sometimes microscopic parallel striations along the cut where tiny imperfections in the edge scratched the surface. Repeated scraping in the same direction stacks those grooves in organized bundles. Teeth don't do that. When an animal gnaws, the surfaces get eroded and crushed. You see U-shaped indentations, polished from saliva and grinding, micro-fractures from repeated pressure. The pattern is chaotic, not linear. And importantly, tooth marks on a bone are usually part of a broader field of damage. Pits, scores, deflaning, shattered ends where the animal tried to reach the marrow. On the best documented Paleolithic flutes, the holes show discrete clusters of V-shaped tool marks around their circumference. You can see where a point was used to start the perforation. Then a series of controlled rotations or scrapings enlarged it. The scratches radiate in a pattern consistent with someone deliberately working from the outside in, turning the bone in their hands. The rest of the bone often cooperates with this interpretation. There may be shaping marks on the ends where the tube was cut to length and the mouthpiece adjusted. There might be longitudinal scraping along the shaft to thin the walls or smooth the surface. All of that stacks up to a narrative of manufacture, not scavenging. Still, archaeologists don't just stop at the holes look neat and tool-marked, so it must be a flute. They also have to rule out the weird ways nature can fake order. One of the classic alternative explanations is puncturing by carnivores in a very unlucky arrangement. Could a hyena, say, bite a bone several times along a line, accidentally creating a row of holes? Could repeated trampling and cracking turn those punctures into something that looks regular? To To test this, researchers go experimental. They give real bones to captive carnivores and let them chew. They study hyena dens and wolf kill sites, cataloging every gnawed fragment they can find. They look for series of holes that line up, and for any cases where animal damage has produced pseudo-regular patterns. The result so far has been underwhelming for the just gnawed camp. You do get holes, you get a lot of broken tubes. What you don't get is a clean, evenly spaced string of perforations with beveled tool-marked edges and no associated marrow extraction damage. They also flipped the experiment. Modern flint knappers and bone workers take fresh bird bones, reindeer bones, even pieces of ivory, and try to reproduce the suspected flute features using only prehistoric, plausible techniques. They drill and scrape holes with stone points. They cut and polish the ends. Then they put those experimental pieces under the same microscopes. If the way the bone failed, the microchipping, the polish, the striation patterns match what's much seen on the archaeological specimens, that boosts the human manufacturer hypothesis. If they don't, it's back to the drawing board. Microscopic analysis plays referee in all of this. High magnification imaging lets researchers separate overlapping histories on a single piece of bone. Maybe an animal did gnaw one end of the shaft, but the finger holes show a completely different suite of marks. Straight V-cuts, instead of crushed edges, oriented in consistent directions, cutting across any older damage. You can even see sequences. A cut that slices through a weathered surface must be younger than the weathering. A gnaw that destroys part of a hole's rim must have happened after the hole was made. In a few cases, the story seems to go, humans shape bone. Animals later chew on it. Then time and geology do the rest. The flute survived, but it got teeth marks as a bonus. Another powerful line of evidence comes from reconstruction. Many of these instruments were not found intact. They came out of the ground as fragments scattered in layers, sometimes collected years apart. When conservators and researchers fit these pieces back together like a 3D jigsaw, they're not just making something pretty for a display. They're testing whether the pattern makes functional sense. If the fragments from different seasons of excavation snugly join to form a continuous tube, with a consistent internal bore and a straight line of holes, that's hard to chalk up to coincidence, especially if you can now blow air through the reconstructed tube and get stable notes. The geometry matters on some ivory flutes. Separate splinters of tusk show matching internal grooves that, when rejoined, form a deliberate circular channel. The outer surfaces carry aligned finger holes. The seams between fragments run where you'd mooring T. I'd expect deliberate splitting and regluing to have occurred, not where random breakage would most likely propagate. Again, experimental work helps here. If you try to split and reassemble ivory with Stone Age methods, you learn what kinds of fracture lines are controllable and what sorts of seams are practically inevitable. That knowledge feeds back into how you interpret archaeological joins. Are you seeing the echoes of someone else's labor, or just the stress patterns of permafrost and time? All of this would be easier if everyone agreed. They don't. From the moment the first Paleolithic flute claims hit the journals, skepticism has been intense. Some researchers argued that at least a few famous examples, especially ones with only 2 or 3 holes, or those found in heavily carnivore disturbed assemblages, were more likely to be hyena-chewed than human-played. Others pointed out that statistically rare regular patterns can emerge from random processes, especially when bones get repeatedly broken and reworked in a cave environment. That criticism was not a nuisance. It was a filter. It forced the field to sharpen its standards. Today, when a new candidate flute turns up, the bar is much higher. It's not enough to have holes sort of in a line. Researchers want multiple well-preserved perforations with clear tool marks, intentional edge modification, consistent spacing, evidence of shaping at the ends, and ideally, a context that fits human activity rather than a carnivore den. They want microscopic documentation, experimental parallels, statistical analysis of spacing, and careful consideration of every alternative explanation. Natural cracking, root etching, trampling, gnawing. Some putative flutes have failed that test and been quietly reclassified as modified bones or chewed remains with ambiguous features. Others, especially the best-preserved aureneation examples from sites like Gisclusterella and Hole of Fells, have emerged from this scrutiny, looking stronger than ever as intentional instruments. In a way, the debate has done for the evidence what time and pressure did for our ancestors. It has put it through a bottleneck. Weak candidates dropped out. The ones that passed through had to survive intense selection. In this case, not from drought or disease, but from skepticism and statistics. What's left isn't proof in the absolute sense. Archaeology rarely gives that, but it is converging lines of evidence, geometry, microwear, experimental replication, reconstruction, all pointing in the same direction. Someone 30,000 or 40,000 years ago wasn't just cracking bones for soup, they were engineering tubes of sound. And once you accept that, another question rises. If these really are flutes, what kind of music were they capable of making? To get a glimpse of that, we have to think about airflow, hole placement, and the physics of pitch. When you strip away the age, the romance, the cave sediment, a flute is still a piece of physics. Take a hollow tube, give it a mouthpiece, open some holes along the side, and air inside that tube will vibrate in very specific ways. Change the length of the vibrating air column. You change the pitch. That's the core of it. Everything else is detail. Those details, though, are exactly what archaeologists and acousticians obsess over. Start with the overall length and bore. For a simple open tube, there's a pretty straightforward relationship between its length and its lowest possible note. Longer tube, lower pitch. Narrower bore, slightly higher pitch for the same length, and a different tone color. So, when researchers measure an Iridian flute, internal diameter, surviving length, whether one end is closed or open, they can plug those numbers into equations that describe standing waves in air. This doesn't tell you they played middle C. It tells you something more like, if you blow this like a modern end-blown flute, the fundamental will fall somewhere around here. That around matters. These are not precision machined steel pipes. They're bird bones and mammoth ivory, often warped, cracked, or incomplete. Tiny differences in wall thickness, minor irregularities in the bore, even subtle damage at the rim, can shift the exact frequency. Then come the finger holes. Each open hole on a flute acts like a shortcut, effectively shortening the tube. The closer a hole is to the mouthpiece, the higher the pitch you get when you open it. The farther away, the lower the resulting note. The diameter of the hole, the spacing between holes, whether other holes are open or closed, all of that shapes the resulting sound. So, when you line up the holes on a 30,000-year-old instrument and measure the distances between them, you're not just admiring the craftsmanship, you're reading off a kind of acoustic blueprint. With some assumptions about how it was held and blown, you can calculate what pitches those positions would favor. Notice the word favor, not produce exactly, every time in all conditions, because this is where theory runs into breath, flesh, and the messy reality of playing. To get closer to that reality, researchers don't stop at math. They build replicas using measurements from the original bones or ivory pieces. They carve new instruments from the same kinds of materials. Not perfect copies. Nobody is allowed to drill extra holes in the originals to see what happens, but careful approximations. They match the length, the bore diameter, the wall thickness where they can. They place the finger holes at the reconstructed positions and give the replicas to skilled players. When someone finally blows into one of these copies, you get data you can't get from a ruler. Which fingerings feel natural? Which combinations of open and closed holes produce stable tones? And which ones squeak, split, or refuse to speak at all? How far can you push the instrument into higher registers by blowing harder? Can you bend notes by shading the holes or changing amber? What's the comfortable range before the flute feels like it's fighting you? From these experiments, patterns emerge. Certain note sequences fall easily under the fingers. Others are technically possible, but awkward. Some replicas produce a near diatonic run of pitches that, if you're steeped in Western music, make your ears perk up. This sounds suspiciously like part of a modern scale. Others give you intervals that feel foreign, somewhere between our standard semitones, not quite fitting onto a piano keyboard at all. This is where interpretation gets dangerous. It's very tempting when you find a run of pitches that happen to line up with, say, a major scale or a minor pentatonic, to jump to, they played the same scale we do. A few early reconstructions did just that, happily publishing recordings of Stone Age tunes and familiar tonal systems. The problem is the physics of tubes and holes doesn't care what culture you belong to. If you space holes more or less evenly along a simple flute, certain interval patterns are going to pop out again and again just because of how air behaves. Some of those patterns overlap with later musical traditions by coincidence, not necessarily by inheritance. When we talk about scales in the Paleolithic, we're really talking about pitch sets, the collection of notes a particular instrument can produce comfortably and repeatedly. That set might resemble part of a modern major scale, or a pentatonic scale, or something that doesn't fit cleanly into any of those boxes. And even then, it tells you what was available, not what was actually used in performance. The truth is, we don't know how those pitches were organized in minds and ears back then. A scale is not just physics, it's a cultural choice. Which notes matter, which combinations feel complete, which intervals sound tense, which feel resolve. Those are learned within a musical tradition, not dictated by bone geometry alone. What we can say cautiously is that some Ornation flutes were capable of producing multiple, distinct, repeatable pitches that form coherent series. That implies more than random tooting. It suggests pattern, maybe even something approaching a tonal system, whatever that system felt like to them. Now, think about what it takes to actually play one of these things. The mouthpiece designs vary. Some are more like recorders with a defined fipple that channels the air across a sharp edge. Others are open at the end, more like a modern knee or shakuhachi, where the player has to shape the air ream with their lips and jaw, aiming it just right at the rim. Either way, breath control is not optional. To get a stable note, you have to coordinate air pressure, direction, and the shape of your mouth. Blow too weakly, the tone is airy or collapses. Too hard, it overblows into a higher harmonic or cracks between pitches. On some reconstructions, there's a sweet spot that's quite narrow. Finding it and then moving around between notes without losing it takes practice. Finger technique matters just as much. On a 4 or 5 hole flute, every finger combination is a little lever that adjusts the effective length of the tube. Some transitions, say lifting one finger at a time, are smooth and ergonomic. Others require awkward stretches or quick shifts that are hard even for a modern player. When archaeologists notice that the good notes on a replica line up with the most comfortable fingerings, that's a hint that the original maker may have experimented, adjusting hole positions to fit human hands and musical intentions. You don't get that kind of ergonomic tuning by accident. It implies trial and error, maybe a tradition of apprenticeship. Someone had to show someone else how to hold the instrument, which fingerings to use, how to shape the breath. That's not just tool use, it's skill transmission. And skill transmission opens the door to something even more intriguing: shared songs. If multiple people in a group are playing similar instruments with similar ranges and fingerings, they're not just sharing tools, they're sharing possibilities. A particular sequence of notes that sits nicely under the fingers and feels satisfying to blow is likely to be discovered, repeated, remembered. Maybe it becomes a personal motif. Maybe it becomes a group tune associated with a hunt, a season, a story. Could the same melody have been played in different caves by different bands over generations? It's a haunting thought, a tune older than any surviving artifact, traveling only in human memory and muscle. Proving that, though, is another matter entirely. Music, unlike stone tools or pigments, doesn't fossilize. The only direct evidence we have from this period are the instruments themselves, and, occasionally, wear patterns that hint at how often certain holes were used. Even if two flutes from distant sites share similar hole layouts and pitch ranges, that doesn't mean their players used those notes in the same way. Parallel design can arise from shared physics and similar hands, not necessarily from a shared repertoire. Some researchers have tried to push the evidence a bit further, analyzing the statistical relationships between hole spacings across multiple flutes. If certain interval patterns keep reappearing, that could hint at a common underlying musical logic. But even there, we're inferring mindset from millimeters, leaping from geometry to culture in a single bound. So we're left in a strange position. We can calculate likely pitch ranges, we can reconstruct plausible fingerings, we can hand replicas to musicians, and hear what kinds of melodies fall naturally under their rule fingers. We can say with some confidence that these instruments were capable of structured, repeatable music, not just random noise. What we can't do is hear with certainty what those people actually played when the cave was dark and the fire was low. And yet, even that uncertainty tells us something important, because to build a flute that can play a scale at all, any scale, you need a mind that understands cause and effect well enough to tinker with sound, a body trained to control breath and fingers in coordinated ways, and a culture that values the invisible patterns that emerge when vibrating air is shaped in time. Those patterns, once they exist, are hard to keep to yourself. They invite listeners, they invite participation, they invite memory, which means that if we want to understand what this little tube of bone was really doing in Ice Age, we can't stay inside the physics forever. We have to step back into the wider world it belonged to, the cold valleys, the crowded caves, the people who carried it, and ask what role music might have played in the daily and nightly life of the Orynesian world. To picture that world, you have to let go of the postcard version of the Ice Age. It's not one endless white landscape with mammoths trudging across a flat plain in slow motion. It's a climate on a knife's edge, twitching between slightly less awful and brutally cold. Temperatures could swing over just a few generations. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Forests slid back and forth across the map, like a nervous hand rearranging furniture. In southern Germany, where some of the famous Ornation flutes were found, you wouldn't have seen an ice sheet outside the cave mouth. Those were farther north, but you would have felt them anyway. Long winters, short, unpredictable summers, steppe tundra stretching away from the river valleys, low shrubs, hardy grasses, scattered clumps of trees, wherever the wind and water allowed it. And animals, the kind of animals that make our modern ecosystems look strangely underpowered. Mammoths and woolly rhinos, herds of wild horses, bison and aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, giant deer with antlers like mobile coat racks, hyenas, lions, wolves, bears, all tuned for cold, lean times. This was not a romantic safari. It was a landscape where a broken leg, a bad season, or a misjudged hunt could end a lineage. Your people, the Orynesians, early modern humans in Europe, moved through this world on foot, mostly following the shifting lines where resources came together. River corridors, ecotones between open steppe and patchy woodland, migration routes of the herds. Permanent villages were not really a thing. Mobility was your insurance policy. Home was whatever you could carry, plus whatever you could improvise. Sometimes that meant caves, especially in places like the Swabian Jura in Germany, or the Terre d'Ordon in France, where limestone had already done the excavation work. Caves weren't just dramatic art galleries. They were windrows, thermal buffers, acoustic chambers. But you didn't live in the deep painted chambers full time. You clustered near the mouth, or in rock shelters, where fire smoke could escape, and you could still see the sky away from caves. Orygeian groups, likely built shelters out of what the environment gave them. Mammoth bones and hides in some regions, wood and branches and turf in others. Picture loud dew structures windshedding rather than lofty. The archaeological record gives fragmentary hints. Post holes here, arcs of stones there, concentrations of bone that look more like construction material than dinner. This wasn't flimsy camping. If you're overwintering on the steppe, your shelter needs to keep a howling January night on the other side of a layer of skin and air. Clothing wasn't optional either. Scrapers and awls from Aurignacian sites are not glamorous, but they matter as much as any ivory figurine. They speak to hide processing, to tailored garments assembled from multiple pieces and stitched together. Some finds suggest the use of piercing tools, fine enough for fitted clothing, not just wrapped furs. In that climate, each improvement in sewing technique is a direct upgrade to your survivability. Fire tied all of this together. You're not just striking sparks occasionally. You're managing embers, transporting fire from camp to camp, feeding it with the right mix of fuel in a treeless or almost treeless landscape. Dung, bone, driftwood, whatever burns. Fire cooks meat, softens sinew, dries hides, hardens wood points, keeps predators nervous, and turns a pitch-black cave into a space where stories and songs can exist at all. Around that fire, the toolkit spreads out. Aurignacian stone tools mark a shift from the earlier Neanderthal technologies in Europe. Long blades struck from carefully prepared cores, standardized forms, burr engraving and carving, end scrapers for working hides, bone, and antler points. In some sites you see delicate barbed points and possible spear thrower precursors a bit later on. This wasn't a random pile of sharp things. It was a deliberately assembled kit tuned to a yearly cycle. Hunting large game, processing carcasses, scraping hides, carving wood, shaping bone, making and repairing the very instruments we're talking about. Each tool has a home in the calendar. The season of heavy hunting, the season of intense clothing production, the season of long evenings when you finally have time to work on more unnecessary projects. Those projects, the flutes, the figurines, the engraved bones force us to ask what unnecessary even means in this world. Socially or in Yesian life, probably revolved around small, flexible bands, maybe 20, 30 people, give or take. A few extended families moving together, hunters, foragers, elders, children, infants. That kind of group is big enough to pull labor and knowledge, small enough to stay nimble, but they weren't isolated bubbles. Raw materials tell on them. When you find seashells far from the sea, obsidian far from volcanoes, or specific flint types hundreds of kilometers from their source, that's evidence of movement, exchange, or both. Many researchers think Aurignac in Europe was crisscrossed by loose social networks. We know the people upriver. We meet the people beyond them when the herds pass through. We recognize their tools, their ornaments, their faces. These networks likely pulsed with the seasons. Imagine winter as a time of contraction. Small groups hunkered down in the most reliable refuges, resources thin, travel risky. Then, as spring and early summer opened the landscape, groups might converge at key points. Salmon runs, reindeer crossings, flint outcrops, good caves. For a few weeks or months, your small world suddenly got bigger. You met potential mates from other bands. You exchanged tools, pigments, stories, techniques. This is one context where music starts to make obvious sense. If you think of the Aurignacian flute as a fragile luxury object, made for art separate from real, that life, it feels out of place in that survival equation. But those categories, practical versus artistic, are ours. They may not have been theirs. A flute can be intensely practical without ever killing an animal or scraping a hide. You can use sound to coordinate. Hunting large, fast, nervous prey as a group is a communication problem as much as a courage problem. You need signals that cut through wind and distance without sounding like prey animals. Drums and shouts do that. so do certain sharp, piercing notes on a flute. Maybe there were specific patterns that meant circle left, drive them, wait. We can't prove those existed, but the physics of sound propagation in open country makes the idea plausible. You can use sound to manage mood. Long winter nights in a cramped shelter, with crying infants and anxious adults, are a recipe for frayed tempers and bad decisions. A calming, repetitive melody can regulate breathing, lower arousal, entrain the group to a slower rhythm. Lullabies are almost universal in human cultures we know. It's not a stretch to imagine a flute line that every child in a band associated with safety and sleep. You can use sound for childcare directly. Hands busy with scraping or sewing. You can't always rock a baby, but you can sing, hum, or blow simple patterns on a flute. Infants are exquisitely tuned to human vocal sound. Wind instruments piggyback on some of the same acoustic features, pitch contours, timbre changes, rhythmic pulses. In that sense, a flute might be as much a parenting tool as a performance instrument. And you can use sound to glue people together. When several groups meet seasonally, they need ways to mark shared identity and reinforce alliances quickly. Ornaments that look familiar, stories that hit known beats, and very likely tunes everyone knows how to join. A recognizable melody, played on a flute, could function like a password, a banner you can hear. We are the people who know this pattern. We belong to this network. In that world, carving a flute isn't a break from survival. It is survival just operating on a different layer. The same hands that butchered mammoths and scraped hides are drilling finger holes in bird bones. The same minds tracking herd movements and weather patterns are also tracking melodic shapes and rhythmic cycles. When an Ornation craftsperson decides to invest hours into cutting, polishing, and tuning a fragile musical instrument, they're making a bet that sound has enough value to warrant time and risk. Maybe that value shows up in more efficient hunts, calmer children, tighter alliances, more cohesive bands. Maybe it shows up in something harder to measure, a shared sense that life is more than hunger and cold, that the world has patterns you can participate in, not just endure. In Ice Age Europe, art is not a luxury tacked onto a finished survival strategy. It's woven through the whole thing. Pigment on walls, carvings in ivory, traces of beads and ornaments, a flute buried in cave sediment. These are not separate from hearths, cutting tools and butchered bones. They're part of the same adaptive system, the same cultural engine that took one small population of bottleneck survivors and over tens of thousands of years turned them into people who could stand in a freezing valley, raise a hollow bone to their lips, and call a pattern of invisible air into being that meant something to everyone who heard it. If you step back from that scene for a second, the fire, the cold, the networks of bands, threading across Ice Age Europe, you run into a huge, slippery question. Why music at all? Because from a strict, stingy calories per hour perspective, music is weird. It burns time. It burns effort. It doesn't obviously feed you, shelter you, or stab anything. So why did our ancestors over and over again, on different continents, end up spending precious hours singing, drumming, humming, carving flutes? There isn't one agreed-upon answer. There are families of answers, and the little Ornation flute we've been talking about sits right at the crossroads of several of them. One big idea is social bonding. Brains like ours are expensive, so are big stable social groups. You have to keep track of who's who owes what, who's upset, who can be trusted. Among primates, one of the main ways to do that is grooming, literally picking through each other's hair. It's intimate, it's soothing, it reinforces alliances. The problem is grooming doesn't scale. You can only groom one individual at a time. A band of 20, 30 people needs something that can glue many minds together at once. Some researchers think music and dance stepped into that role, singing in unison, moving in sync, locking onto a shared beat. These activities trigger the same chemistry as grooming and touch, endorphins, oxytocin, all the quiet little molecules of trust. Laughing together, and chanting together both do this. In that view, music is a sort of vocal grooming, a way to bathe a whole group in shared emotion, without having to go person by person with your fingers. Another idea focuses on mate attraction across the animal kingdom. Elaborate, costly displays often show up in mating bird song, bow-word art installations, antlers, peacock tails. The logic is simple. If you can afford to waste energy on something spectacular and useless, you must be healthy and well-fed enough that your basic needs are easily met. Apply that to humans, and musical skill becomes a kind of advertisement. If you can maintain rhythm, remember complex patterns, improvise in time with others, you're demonstrating cognitive horsepower, motor control, emotional sensitivity. If you can carve and tune a flute, you're adding patience, fine motor skills, and knowledge of materials. Under this theory, a musician isn't just entertaining, they're quietly broadcasting. I can invest in difficult, long-term projects. I have resources. I'm worth mating with. Then there's the parent-infant angle. Human babies are born absurdly helpless. Their brains are still wiring up. They need years of intense care, and they're wired from day one to respond to certain kinds of sound, rising and falling pitch, exaggerated timing, gentle repetition. The Singong way adults talk to babies, infant-directed speech, is practically musical. Simple melodies, stretched vowels, steady pulse. Music may have grown out of this emotional channel, soothing a baby with song, keeping them engaged while you work, signaling safety or playfulness through tone. These are powerful tools. If your lullabies work better, your infants cry less, sleep more, thrive slightly better. Your genes and your cultural style get a small edge. Over hundreds of generations, that pressure could sculpt a species that, good at and hungry for musical sound. A fourth family of ideas is about group coordination, hunting in formation, carrying heavy loads together, grinding grain in teams, rowing, marching. All of these get easier and more efficient when everyone's movements are synchronized. A strong beat helps with that. So do call and response patterns, work songs, marching chants. Music in this frame is a timing device. It keeps spears going forward together, paddles dipping together, feet landing together. It helps people endure pain and fatigue because the shared rhythm distracts from discomfort and reinforces a sense of, we're in this as one unit in a dangerous environment. A group that can coordinate like that might outcompete a group that can't. Now layer on another concept that cuts across all these theories: costly signaling. The basic idea is that some behaviors are so expensive in time or risk that only individuals or groups with real underlying strength can afford them. That's why a peacock tail works as a signal. It's a handicap. If you can survive predators and still drag that tail around, you must be robust. Complex music can function the same way. Spending an evening rehearsing, learning long vocal lines, building instruments that don't directly put food on the table. These are costly. A band that can afford a flute is telling the world, we're stable enough that someone can sit and carve bone for hours instead of scouting for food. We have the slack in our system to support specialists. On the individual level, a skilled player is broadcasting. I had time to practice instead of constantly scrambling to survive. I have social support. I belong. But not everyone thinks of music primarily as a signal. Another way to see it is as emotional technology. In that view, music is a tool our species invented to manipulate internal states, our own and other people's. It can dial fear up in a hunting ritual, or dial it down around a fire. It can smooth over conflict by creating a moment of shared feeling. It can help you rehearse memories, invoke ancestors, mark transitions from child to adult, alive to dead. Emotional states are not fluff. They shape every practical decision. Whether you cooperate or defect, whether you panic or hold the line, whether you keep walking or give up. A technology that can reliably reshape those states on demand has real survival value. This is where the difference between having music and having instruments matters. Humans almost certainly sang, clapped, and drummed on things long before anyone drilled finger holes into a vulture bone. Your voice is free, built in, always with you. Hands and feet are drums you can't misplace. Instruments are different. They're an investment. To make a flute, you need good raw material, knowledge of how to hollow it without splitting, how to place the mouthpiece and finger holes so they produce stable notes, and enough patience to start over if you crack the bone halfway through. You're turning a perishable animal part into a fragile object that only does one thing. It produces controlled sound. Why is that a leap? Because it suggests that music isn't just happening spontaneously around the work you already have to do. It's important enough to justify its own dedicated tools. It has become a domain where skill can accumulate, where knowledge can be passed down, where specialists can exist. You can improvise a rhythm on a log with no preparation. You can't improvise a tuned, playable flute without prior cultural know-how. So, where does our 30,000-year-old flute sit in this forest of theories? It fits the social bonding story very well. A melodic instrument is perfect for leading group songs, for setting shared rhythms and emotional tone. It meshes with the mate attraction theory too. The sheer technical difficulty of playing a flute, let alone making one, makes it an excellent display of competence and fine control. It doesn't fight the parent-infant hypothesis either. A soft, bready flute line can mimic some of the contours of a human voice. It could have been used like a portable lullaby, a sonic comfort object you can pull out when a child won't settle, and it dovetails with group coordination. Sharp notes can act as signals over distance. Repeated motifs can lock a group into step. From the costly signaling angle, the flute might be doing double duty. It's a personal skill signal when someone plays it well. It's a group-level signal simply by existing. We are the kind of people who pour labor into fragile, beautiful sound machines. From the emotional technology angle, it's almost overqualified. A flute can do things your voice can't easily do. Long, sustained tones without words, sliding pitches, eerie timbres that shift the mood of a space instantly. It gives a small Ice Age band more control over the emotional atmosphere they live in day after day. What the flute doesn't do is point us cleanly to one single reason music evolved. The Orynesian people who played it didn't have to pick one. When they raised it to their lips, they might have been courting, soothing a child, calling hunters into position, marking a ritual, or just enjoying the strange controllable feeling of sound pouring out of their own breath. Music could have started as cradle song and become courtship display. It could have begun as hunting signal and drifted into worship. It can be all of these things at once. What the bone in that cave really tells us is that by 30,000 years ago, music wasn't an accidental side effect of language or a random pastime that happened when chores were done. It was important enough to shape matter around it, to leave durable traces in the archaeological record. And if music was already woven that deeply into Orynesian life, then the cognitive machinery behind it, planning, abstraction, a sense of pattern and expectation, must have been running at a very high level. Which brings us to the next big shift. This little flute forces us to confront what it says about the minds that made it, and the kind of thinking they were capable of, long before writing cities or civilization as we usually define it. For a long time, the story textbooks told about people in the Upper Paleolithic went something like this. Yes, their brains were technically like ours, but their days were supposedly dominated by raw survival. Wake up, don't freeze, don't starve, don't get eaten, don't get sick. Maybe tell a few stories by the fire, but mostly it's spears and scraping hides and trying not to die. The 30,000-year-old flute does something very simple and very rude to that story. It makes it look childish, because once you start taking the flute seriously as a human artifact, you can't avoid the hidden skills baked into it. A flute is a fossilized thought process. Start with planning. You don't accidentally make a flute. There's no path where someone just pokes a bone a few times and surprise. It plays a pentatonic scale. First, Someone has to recognize that a certain kind of bone, hollow, straight, with specific wall thickness, is worth keeping. That means they're looking at an animal carcass and already thinking 2-3 steps ahead. Meat, fat, sinew, instrument. Then they have to strip it, clean it, maybe let it dry to the right degree. They have to decide where the mouthpiece will be, where the finger holes will go, and in what order to do the work so they don't split the tube. That's sequencing. That's project management. If you drill the wrong spot first, the bone cracks. If you make the hole too big, the pitch drops. Too small, and it's hard to play. You can't undo a hole. So, the maker is holding a mental model of the finished object in their head, while it, still just bone. They're running little simulations. If I cut here, it will do that. That's abstract causality. That's engineering. Then there's measurement. We don't know exactly what scales Iranian musicians preferred, but the holes on several Ice Age flutes are not random. Their spacing, relative to the length of the tube lines, up surprisingly well, with intervals that sound stable to modern ears. You don't need tape measures for that, but you do need some repeatable system, maybe finger widths, maybe knuckle lengths, maybe counting off distances by eye after years of practice. Whatever the method, it means somebody had an internal sense of proportion. They knew if the hole is this far from the end, it will give me a higher note. If I move it a little, the pitch slides. They might not have had the word octave, but they were clearly navigating a landscape of pitch with intentional steps, not random stabs in the dark. Add fine motor control to the pile, carving and drilling bone precisely with stone tools without shattering the whole thing is not trivial. It requires exquisite hand-eye coordination, pressure control, patience. You have to feel the give of the material, adjust angle and force in real time, stop before you go too far. If you've ever tried to drill a neat round hole in something brittle with the wrong tools, you know how quickly it goes wrong. Now, imagine doing that in a cave by firelight with flint. You're looking at a nervous system tuned to micro-movements. That same nervous system is attached to a brain that can imagine the sound it wants before it exists. And then there's iterative design. The flutes we dig up are the survivors, the successful versions. They quietly imply a graveyard of failures we'll never see. Cracked bones, bad tunings, awkward hole placements that didn't quite work. At some point, a person must have blown into a half-finished flute, frowned, and thought, no, that's not right. Then tried again. That's a loop. Prototype, test, evaluate, modify. Evolution can do that unconsciously with genes. Here, culture is doing it consciously with objects. That's not brute survival. That's R&D. Now widen the lens from the individual to the group. A single genius can invent something by accident. A tradition, the kind of thing that shows up at multiple sites across a region, needs teaching. Flute making, like napping or fire management, implies apprenticeship. Someone has to watch someone else do it. They have to imitate gestures, copy sequences, remember which mistakes to avoid. The fact that multiple Orani flutes share design similarities hints at shared norms. This is the right way to make one. That's cultural transmission. It tells us these people weren't just copying by trial and error in isolation. They had concepts they passed down, maybe even named steps, where to hold, how hard to blow, which finger pattern gives, which melody. They might have had specialists, individuals known for making particularly good instruments, whose knowledge was sought out and emulated. And teaching isn't just motor skills. To teach someone a musical instrument, however informally, you have to point their attention at invisible patterns, rhythm, pitch, phrasing. Listen, do you hear how this note is higher than that one? Try matching it. That brings us to symbolism. Stone tools and spears are tangible. They act directly on the visible world. Hit rock, cut meat, pierce, hide. A flute acts on something you can't see at all. Air pressure variations we experience as sound. When you carve a flute, you're shaping a future experience, a pattern in time. not a permanent mark in space. It's art that's only there while it's happening. To invest so much effort in a device for making invisible vanishing structures suggests a robust imagination. The maker has to care about experiences that don't endure physically, but do endure in minds. Melodies remembered, moods evoked, rituals marked. This is symbolic thought at work. A pattern of pitches can stand for something else: a season, a clan, a story, a spirit, a lover. A particular melody might be the song we play for the dead, or the call together, or the tune that belongs to our group. The sound doesn't resemble those things in any obvious way. The link between them is agreed upon, conventional, learned. That's the same kind of mental move you need for language, for art, for religion. Using one thing to stand for another in a stable, shared way. And yet, it's important not to get carried away. The flute can't tell us what those symbols were. It doesn't encode the grammar of their speech, the content of their myths, the precise structure of their rituals. We don't know if a given melody meant hunt, or marriage, or rain. We also can't say that the existence of a flute proves some specific modern-style institution. There's no direct evidence, for instance, that there were professional musicians in the Ice Age the way we think of them now. We shouldn't imagine orchestras tuning up in the cave. What the flute does strongly suggest is more general and in some ways more profound. It tells us that by 30,000 years ago, at least some human groups could plan multi-step projects with delayed rewards, could measure and standardize aspects of the physical world for aesthetic ends, could refine designs across generations instead of reinventing them from scratch, could teach intricate non-obvious skills through observation, imitation, and probably speech, could treat ancient experiences, sounds, moods, patterns in time, as things worth crafting on purpose. That last point is where the old stereotypes really crumble. A mind that can carve time into melody is not just a mind obsessed with calories and warmth. It's a mind that has room for anticipation, nostalgia, beauty, maybe even boredom, and the desire to fill it creatively. The Oronasian person sitting with that bone wasn't simply fighting the environment. They were shaping an inner environment too, curating how it felt to be alive inside their own head and their own group. Which means that when we listen to a reconstruction of that flute today, we're not just hearing a quaint, prehistoric noisemaker, wheeled, overhearing a conversation about what matters that started tens of thousands of years ago. And the next stop on that conversation is to look at how this invisible art of sound sits alongside the other wonders of their world: painted walls, carved figurines, and symbols scratched into bone. All part of a single shared culture of imagination. Walk deeper into that culture, and the flute stops looking like an oddity and starts looking like one voice in a full-blown chorus, because the people who made these instruments were also filling their world with images and objects that didn't have to exist in order for them to stay alive. Think of the Orconian layers in caves like Holes, Giesingcluster, Vogelherd. In the same sediments where we find bone flutes, we also find tiny carved figurines, half lion, half human beings, lolling mammoths with curved backs, sleek horses, abstract shapes whose meanings we can only guess at. We find pierced animal teeth and shells worn smooth from contact with skin. We find beads made from ivory, arranged in patterns that suggest they were once sewn onto clothing or strung as necklaces. This isn't random clutter. Archaeologists talk about an Aurignacian cultural package because certain things repeatedly show up together across wide regions: specific stone tool types, personal ornaments, figurative carvings, and music. If you lay all of those side by side on a table, the flute looks less like a luxury and more like a missing piece. Visual art, body art, sound art, different media, same underlying habit, taking the raw materials of the world and turning them into shared symbols. Now imagine, not as a certainty, but as a plausible scene, how those media might have met in actual human lives. You have a cave with images painted or carved on the walls, animals, hand stencils, abstract marks. Not every Ornasian site has stunning murals like Chauvet or Lusco, but enough do that it's reasonable to think of wall art as one of the options in their repertoire. Those images don't move. They sit there static, waiting. Music, by contrast, is pure motion. It unfolds in time, and then it's gone. Put the two together, and you get something powerful. A way to create events around places. Maybe certain parts of a cave weren't just walk-through corridors, but destinations. The chamber with the big bison, the spot with the strange composite creature. People could gather there at specific times, after a hunt, at a birth, at the change of a season, and bring those images to life with sound. Here's where the flute stops being a cute Ice Age gadget and becomes social technology. If you want a group to feel that a particular place and moment matters, you have to mark it somehow. You can change the light, you can change what people wear, and you can change what they hear. A melody played only in that chamber, only during a certain activity, could fuse in memory with what the walls show. The painted horse and the rising phrase on the flute become one thing in the minds of the Tolkien. See one, and you recall the other. Over time, that repetition can harden into what we'd recognize as tradition. Not written, not recorded, but stored in bodies and expectations. This is the tune we use when we stand here and talk about them. Them might mean ancestral animals. It might mean real ancestors. It might mean beings we would be tempted to call spirits or gods. We don't know, but the structure is familiar. Image plus sound plus coordinated attention equals story. And then there are the people themselves, the moving parts of this whole system. Those beads and pendants weren't invisible under 5 layers of clothing. Many were found in ways that suggest they were sewn onto the outer surfaces of garments, or worn at the neck, wrist, or head. Some pieces show wear only on one edge, consistent with hanging and swinging. Others are stained with red ochre, as if they were part of broader body painting practices. Personal adornment means someone cared how they appeared to other people, not just functionally, but symbolically. A string of fox teeth around your neck could say, "I hunted this," or "I am associated with whatever powers we think the fox has." A particular arrangement of ivory beads could mark you as part of a certain kin group, or as someone who has gone through a specific initiation. When everyone is basically wearing versions of the same animal skins, these added details become the badges and logos of that world. Now fold music into that. If specific ornaments and clothing styles are tied to certain identities, age, clan, role, then it's not a huge leap to imagine that certain sounds were tied to them too. Not in a modern, "this is our national anthem" way, but in a looser, practice-based sense. Particular patterns on the flute that tend to be played when a certain group assembles, rhythms that tend to accompany a certain kind of dance, a fragment of melody that signals now it's your turn, or this is about your story. Once you have that, you have the ingredients for group memory. Because in a world without writing, you can't just say, "Open the book to chapter 3. You have to recruit your senses as filing systems. A scar, a pendant, a wall image, a refrain on a flute. They can all become hooks to hang recollections on. When you hear the old melody, you remember the last time it was played, and the time before that. You remember who was there, what happened, who is missing now. The sound pulls a thread that unravels a string of past events. Over generations, those remembered events can blur, condense, and take on shapes that are more than just what happened to me. They can become origin stories. Maybe the tale of a particularly lucky hunt, retold dozens of times with the same musical intro, grows into the story of how our people came to have a special relationship with reindeer. Maybe the intense experience of sheltering in a cave during a storm, with everyone pressed together while someone plays to calm the children, becomes the seed of a myth about the protective spirit of that cave. Again, we have to be careful. The archaeological record doesn't let us point at a specific flute and say, "This one was used to tell the story of the sky being a giant animal's hide. That's fantasy. What we can say is that music, images, and adornment provide a flexible toolkit for weaving individual experiences into shared narratives. When a group repeats particular combinations of sound, place, and symbol, often enough, those combinations start to feel like they've always been that way. They feel bigger than any one person. They feel given. That feeling is one of the foundations of culture, and that's what the Aurinian Gallery of Wonders really hints at. Not just isolated acts of creativity, but a mesh of practices that continuously reinforced one another. Visual art gave the eyes something to latch onto. Ornaments turned bodies into moving canvases of identity. Music stitched moments together, turned gatherings into events, and events into memories. Each one made the others more powerful. You come into the cave and see the familiar figures glowing in flickering light. You recognize the beadwork on the people around you. You hear the opening bars of a tune you've known since childhood. Before anyone says a word, you already know what kind of occasion this is, what sort of meanings are in play. That's how a scattered species turns into us and our way of doing things long before cities or writing or recorded history. And standing quietly in that network, almost humble in its simplicity, is the flute. Not just an instrument, but a key, one of several that unlocked a shared imaginative world and helped keep it stable enough to hand down. Which raises an awkward question for the story we tell about our own specialness. If that cultural package was already flourishing in Ice Age Europe, what does that say about the other humans sharing the continent at the time, especially the Neanderthals, whose own traces of art and adornment have long been dismissed or downplayed? To answer that, we have to walk out of the Aurynasian concert hall and into a much more contested space, the edge of the debate about who exactly could do what in the deep human past. When we talk about the Holy Fels flute or the instruments from nearby Suabian caves, the default assumption in most papers and documentaries is simple: Aurynasian layers, anatomically modern human bones in the same general levels. Therefore, modern humans made this. And for the famous 3,500 and 40,000-year-old bone flutes, that's currently the safest reading. They sit squarely in what archaeologists call early Upper Paleolithic contexts in central U.S. Skell, where based on the fossils we actually have, Homo sapiens seems to be the only game in town. But step back from that narrow window and the picture of Europe gets much messier. For a long stretch before and after 40,000 years ago, this continent wasn't a stage for one species. It was a crowded, overlapping map. Neanderthals had been here for hundreds of thousands of years, riding out multiple ice ages. They left their own dense trail of stone tools, hearths, bones, and shelters from Iberia to the Middle East. Modern humans arriving from Africa via the Near East didn't just sweep in and instantly replace them. In some regions, Neanderthals are still present as late as 40, 30, 7,000 years ago. In others, modern human occupations appear as early as 45,000 or so. For a few thousand years, again, a blink in geological terms, but many, many lifetimes, those two populations overlapped in space and time. Add denizens further east, and this late Plian world looks less like a straight line and more like a braided river, channels diverging, rejoining, flowing alongside each other. So, when you pick up a bone fragment with holes in it from a cave layer dated, say, 50,000 years ago in southern Europe, you are immediately on the edge of a tricky question. Whose hands did this pass through? That's where the debate heats up. There are a few finds that sit right in this contested zone. The most notorious is probably the so-called Neanderthal flute from Diva Babe in Slovenia, a cave bear fure with a series of punctures along one side. One camp argues those holes are the result of carnivore tooth marks and post-depositional damage, nothing to do with music at all. Another camp points to the spacing, the alignment, and the shape of the openings, and says, no, this looks intentional, and it comes from a layer most researchers would attribute to Neanderthals. If that bare bone really is a flute, then Neanderthals were making wind instruments tens of thousands of years before the Holy Fels examples. If it isn't, then the oldest securely dated flutes stay firmly in the modern human column. The controversy isn't just about one object, it's about what we allow Neanderthals to be capable of. For much of the 20th century, the story went like this. Neanderthals were strong, but dull, brutal survivors, with limited language, little art, and no real symbolic life. Then modern humans show up with beads, cave paintings, musical instruments, and true culture, out-competing the primitive locals. That story has been eroding for decades. We now have Neanderthal sites with pierced shells that seem to have been used as ornaments. We have pigments including red and yellow ochre that look like they were processed for use on bodies or objects. Possible engravings on bones and cave walls. Very structured hunting and butchery practices. Evidence for caring for injured group members over long periods. There are even recently reported cave markings in Spain, dated by uranium-thorium methods to over 60,000 years ago, before modern humans are known in that region, that some interpret as Neanderthal art. Not everyone agrees, but the old caricature of Neanderthals as culture-free is very hard to maintain. That's why the question of instruments matters so much. It's not musical nationalism for extinct hominins. It's about where we draw the line between us and them in terms of cognition and imagination. If Neanderthals independently invented flutes, or even adopted them from contact with modern humans and made them part of their own practices, then music is no longer our exclusive cognitive trophy. It becomes something at least two human species found value in, a shared solution to the problem of making meaning together. On the other hand, if all the good evidence for structured music comes from clearly modern human contexts that supports a different picture, perhaps something about our particular lineage, our vocal control, our social network size, our pattern-seeking tendencies, pushed sound into this especially elaborate symbolic role. So, how do archaeologists try to decide, in any given case, who made what? It comes down to a few main pillars: context, dating, and traces of manufacturer. Context is king. A find from a sealed, well-stratified layer, where all the other artifacts, fauna, and sediments point to a particular cultural tradition, is very different from a loose bone dug out in the 1920s and kept in a museum drawer. If a perforated bone sits in a layer packed with most stone tools, the classic Neanderthal toolkit, and we have independent dating that places that layer squarely before any known modern human presence in the region, then a Neanderthal attribution is much more plausible. If the bone comes from a disturbance where older and younger layers have slumped together, or from an excavation with poor recording standards, caution ramps up. It might have moved, it might be intrusive, it might be a chimera of context mashed into one. Dating is the second pillar. Radioargon on associated charcoal, uranium-thorium on speleos, thermoluminescence on heated sediments. Each method has its own strengths and error margins. Researchers look not just for a single date, but for a coherent pattern, multiple samples from the same layer that cluster in a narrow time window. The famous Aronnachian flutes benefit from this robustness. They come from carefully excavated contexts, with a suite of dates that all converge on early, Upper Paleolithic ages, after Neanderthals have vanished from that part of Europe. The divisive Dibja Bababe bone, in contrast, comes from a more complex stratigraphy and older excavations. Different teams interpret the layering and disturbance differently, so the same object can be slotted into a Neanderthal world or into a more ambiguous one, depending on which reconstruction you trust. Then there are the manufacturing traces on the object itself. Human modification leaves certain signatures. Cut marks from stone tools have characteristic cross-sections. Drilling and scraping tend to produce different microscars than carnivore chewing or natural weathering. Regular spacing of holes in roughly a straight line is harder to generate randomly than a scatter of bite punctures. With a hole of fells and gaze cluster of flutes, the evidence leans very strongly toward deliberate shaping. Selected bird bones or mammoth ivory, carefully thinned walls, smoothed edges around the finger holes, beveled blowing ends. Experiments show these features are just what you would expect if someone wanted to produce controllable sound. With more marginal cases, the line is blurrier. Some scientists look at a bone and see standardized hole placement. Others see coincidence layered over damage. Under magnification, one person's drill mark is another's tooth gouge. Add in the fact that music leaves almost no direct archaeological signature beyond the instruments themselves. No musical notation, no recorded sound, and you end up with a field where interpretation plays an unusually large role. That's why most careful researchers speak in probabilities, not absolutes. Consistent with Neanderthal authorship, most likely produced by modern humans. Ambiguous, further evidence required. What would actually settle some of these debates? The gold standard would be a find that stacks all the lines of evidence in the same direction. A clearly artificial instrument in primary context, in a layer that also contains diagnostic, fossils from one species, and a tightly constrained set of dates. Imagine, for instance, a bone flute emerging from a sealed Mustasterian hearth, with Neanderthal skeletal remains in direct association and radiometric dates, putting everything at 70,000 years ago. Or conversely, a cache of unmistakably modern human burials, each with a personal instrument, in a region and period where Neanderthals had long since disappeared. Short of that, incremental gains help. Better excavation methods, reanalysis of old collections with modern microscopes, more refined dating of cave sequences, new sites that fill in the patchy map between well-known regions. And there's another possibility we shouldn't rule out, that the clean boundary some people are searching for simply doesn't exist. Interbreeding means genes flowed between Neanderthals and modern humans. Cultural contact likely meant ideas and techniques flowed as well. It's entirely plausible that some musical practices were shared, borrowed, or co-created at contact zones, leaving behind objects that don't sit neatly in a single box. For now, the safest thing we can say is this. The oldest firmly identified flutes found in Europe, sit inside a modern human cultural package. But the broader capacity for symbolic behavior, and maybe even for making sound into something more than noise, was present in other human species too. Between those two statements lies exactly the edge we're standing on, a frontier where every new bone, every redated cave, has the potential to nudge our picture of who could do what in the deep past. And while researchers argue about tooth marks and tool scars, another challenge lurks in the background. Even if we could pin a given flute to Neanderthals or modern humans beyond reasonable doubt, we'd still be left with the hardest question of all. How on earth do we get from a silent artifact to the living performances it once made possible? You can't press play on the past. There are no recordings of Orrinasian concerts, no notation scratched on cave walls that says, "Repeat chorus twice." Then everyone hums. The only thing that comes out of the ground is mute material. Bone, stone, charcoal, ash, pigment. So, how do you get from that to people gathered around a fire, someone lifting a flute, breath moving through bone, notes hanging in cold air? Archaeologists have to work backwards, and one of their main tools for doing that is something called experimental archaeology. At first glance, that sounds like a fancy name for arts and crafts, but it's a lot more systematic than that. Take the Holy Fells flute. If you want to know whether it really could have been a functional instrument, you don't just look at it, you try to make one, not with a Dremel and sandpaper, but with the kinds of tools its makers would actually have had. Aurignacian people weren't using steel awls and precision drills. They had flint blades, burins, scrapers, maybe organic tools like antler punches. They had patience and practice. So, experimental archaeologists start with a fresh bird bone or a block of mammoth ivory and try to recreate the known artifact step by step. How do you split ivory lengthwise without shattering it? How thin can you grind the walls of a vulture bone before they crack? How long does it actually take to scrape and polish those neat round finger holes using only stone? This is where reality checks start appearing. Sometimes they discover that an apparently simple object is anything but. Getting the internal bore smooth enough for stable sound, aligning the finger holes so they produce a usable scale, shaping the blowing edge so it speaks clearly. Each of those can represent hours of deliberate labor. Other times they stumble onto something else. There might only be a few viable ways to produce the exact pattern of marks seen on the original. If every attempt that produces a playable flute also produces the same kind of microchipping around the finger holes and the same thinning pattern in the bone walls, that's a clue. It means the archaeological specimen probably passed through a similar chain of actions. On the flip side, experiments can show how easily a bone will snap, how quickly unprotected edges wear down, or how a single misplaced blow ruins the acoustics. That says something about skill. If an ornation instrument survives in almost complete form, with carefully placed holes and functioning wall thickness, it's unlikely to be someone's very first try. But experiments are still just models. They suggest possibilities. They highlight constraints. They don't prove what actually happened. To get closer to that, researchers turn to use wear analysis. Under a microscope, a bone flute stops being a single object and becomes a landscape of tiny surfaces. Some are dull and rough. Others are glossy and smooth. Some are crossed with microscopic scratches that all run in similar directions. Those differences matter. Polish on the underside of a bone, for example, might indicate where fingers rested again and again, burnishing the surface over time. A ring of tiny parallel scratches around a finger hole could come from repeated contact with fingernails or callus-used skin. Distinctive rounding and smoothing at the mouthpiece might reflect constant friction with lips or teeth. Then there are the traces left by manufacturer itself. Stone tools tend to cut and scrape in particular ways. A burine used to open a hole leaves a different microsignature than a carnivore's tooth driven through fresh bone. Under magnification, one produces sets of regular V-shaped striations. The other produces crushing concidal fractures, radiating cracks. Add chemical analysis, and things get more interesting. Sometimes residues cling to these surfaces, traces of ochre, fragments of plant fibers, tiny deposits of resin, even microscopic bits of plaque or saliva inside the bore. Each of those opens another line of reasoning. Was the flute decorated, wrapped with bindings, sealed with glue, actually blown, or just carved? None of these marks taken alone can stand up and say, I was used to play music for 20 years at winter gatherings, but together they can tilt the probabilities. If the only wear on a bone flute is concentrated around the bite like punctures, with no polishing where fingers would grip, no smoothing on a mouthpiece, no internal residue from breath or moisture, skepticism rises. Maybe we're just looking at carnivore damage that happens to line up in a way our pattern-hungry brains find musical. If instead we see polish consistent with handling, rounded and smoothed edges at the blowing end, standardized hole placement, and internal residues that don't match simple taphonomic processes, the musical interpretation gains weight. Still, there's a step archaeologists are very cautious about, and that's ethnographic analogy. This is when we look at how living or historically documented groups use similar objects, and then ask whether that can help us imagine the behavior behind a 30,000-year-old artifact. For flutes, there's a rich cross-cultural archive. In many societies, bone flutes are played in small ensembles. In others, specific instruments are restricted to initiation rituals or certain genders. Some are used for long-distance signaling, some for courting, some to imitate animal calls. Looking at that variety does two things. It makes it very hard to say a flute must have meant X, but it also shows just how many social roles a simple tube with holes can occupy. So when archaeologists infer that Aurignacian flutes were probably used in communal contexts, maybe ceremonies, maybe coordinated dances. They're not pulling that out of nowhere. They're drawing on patterns observed in many independent cultures where music is tightly bound up with group identity, ritual, and storytelling. The danger is assuming too much. Just because a particular indigenous group in the Amazon uses bird bone flutes in men-only secrecy doesn't mean Ice Age Europeans did the same. Ethnographic analogy is at its strongest when it suggests ranges of possibility, not when it claims direct continuity. And yet, even carefully used, it adds another thread. Now, put all of this together. On one side, you have experimental work showing that the object in question can be built with stone tools in a way that matches the archaeological specimen, and that it produces stable, intentional notes rather than random whistles. On another, use-wear and residue studies suggest prolonged handling, repeated contact in specific zones, possible traces of lips, breath, or decorative pigment, none of which are easily explained by natural processes alone. Layered over that, you have contextual information. The flute comes from a well-dated Ornean layer associated with hearths, ornaments, and other signs of symbolic behavior. And floating above all of it, you have ethnographic comparisons telling you that across hundreds of cultures, when people invest time into making tuned instruments, they almost always plug them into socially meaningful practices, rituals, dances, narratives, not just idle noise-making. Each of those lines of evidence is by itself weak. Anyone can be questioned. Experiments are only approximations. Microware can be ambiguous. Ethnographic data can mislead. But science doesn't always advance on single killer proofs. In deep prehistory, it often advances by stacking probabilities. When multiple weak signals start pointing in the same direction, they become something stronger. Not certainty, not we know exactly what song they played on the solstice of 32,000 B.C., but a robust inference. These weren't random chewed bones. They were deliberately made, carefully used instruments that likely played a recurring role in the social and symbolic life of their makers. And once you accept that, another question comes into focus. If these flutes were part of patented performances, things people anticipated, practiced for, remembered, what exactly were those gatherings doing for Ice Age communities? What was the social power of sound, strong enough to justify the risk and effort of making music in a harsh, uncertain world? Start with the easiest image to believe in: night. The day's work is done. The animals you depend on are either sleeping, chewing, or safely roasting. The wind is needling through the valley, temperatures dropping fast. People draw in toward the one reliable source of light and warmth they have: a fire or a cluster of fires. This is where sound changes its job. During the day, sound is mostly about information: cracks of branches announcing movement, shouts coordinating a hunt, calls to keep track of children, to warn of snakes, to find a missing tool. At night, once everyone is pulled into the same small circle of light, sound can start doing something else, shaping how that group feels. A flute in that context isn't background entertainment. It's a way of steering a room full of nervous, exhausted, sometimes grieving primates through a few hours where they can't work, but they also can't afford to fall apart. Think about what evenings might have meant in Ice Age Europe. You've spent the day dealing with cold, scarcity, predators, injuries that today would send you straight to an emergency room. You've watched people you know die from infections we would cure with a pill. You know in a very immediate way that there is no guarantee your group will exist next year. Now you're all sitting in the dark with time to think. That's dangerous. Humans are very good at spiraling. Fear can spread silently. A glance at the sky, a shared memory of last winter's famine, a story about strangers seen on the far ridge. Music is one way to interrupt that spiral. Across a huge range of cultures, music shows up in moments where emotions need to be managed, not ignored. Lullabies soften fear and coax sleep. Chants steady the nerves before a hunt or battle. Wails and low songs give shape to grief that would otherwise rip people apart from the inside. We don't know exactly how Oronian people used their flutes, but the contexts we find them in, deep caves, dwellings with hearths and ornaments, are the same kinds of places where in later societies, music gets wrapped tightly around ritual and feeling. Imagine one small concrete scenario. Someone has died, maybe in a hunting accident, maybe from disease. The body has been dealt with, buried, or taken away, but the absence hasn't. The group is left with all this loose, dangerous emotion. You can in principle sit in silence and let that slowly mutate into anxiety, blame, or fatalism. Or you can do what humans overwhelmingly seem to have done, gather and make sound together. A low, repeated melody on a bone flute, voices rising and falling, not necessarily with words in our sense, but with recognizable patterns, rhythms tapped on logs or stone. This doesn't erase grief. It gives it a path. It turns individual private suffering into something synchronized and shared. If you want to talk about survival value, that matters. Groups that can metabolize grief without splintering are more likely to stay intact long enough to raise children and pass on knowledge. In that sense, music isn't just decoration, it's social first aid. The same goes for fear. You're in a cave far from daylight, torchlight shivering on the walls. The acoustics are strange. Every scrape and whisper is amplified, stretched. If you walk into that space alone, it can be terrifying. If you walk in with 20 people, all humming or chanting in unison, the terror changes flavor. Caves are not just holes in rock. They're acoustic instruments. Their echoes, resonance, and low-frequency vibrations can do odd things to your nervous system. In some chambers, a single note can bloom and hang in the air or beat against itself as echoes collide. Some researchers have suggested that certain Upper Paleolithic paintings cluster in zones that also have unusual acoustic properties, places where claps or vocalizations sound especially dramatic. From there, it's a short mental step to ritual. Now, we have to be careful here. The word ritual covers everything from formal religion to the way you always tap a doorway with your knuckles before entering. Prehistoric ritual doesn't mean organized priesthoods or written mythologies. It can mean any repeated structured behavior that a group uses to mark boundaries between night and day, hunt and feast, life and death, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Sound is perfect for that. You don't need carved idols or permanent architecture to run a ritual. You need bodies, memories, and patterns. A certain sequence of flute notes, a chant everyone knows, a specific rhythm you only ever hear at solstices or after a successful hunt. Those can all signal the normal rules are suspended. We are doing something special now. In this frame, music becomes a kind of social switch. It flips people into a different mode of attention. Children stop squabbling. Adults stop arguing about who carried more meat. Focus narrows onto the shared sonic event. Some anthropologists have proposed that music and rhythm can help induce altered states of consciousness, trance, dissociation, or just very intense absorption. That's a tricky thing to talk about in prehistory, because we don't have diaries from Aurignacian shamans describing their visions. What we do have are later and ethnographically documented traditions where repetitive sound, especially in echoing or enclosed spaces, is used to loosen ordinary awareness. If anything like that was happening in Ice Age Europe, caves would have been ideal laboratories for it. A drum beat or flute tone, repeated for long stretches, multiplied by echo, experienced by a body tired, cold, and maybe slightly hungry. That's a recipe for sensory strangeness. But notice something important. Even if individuals felt altered or entranced, the process itself is social. You get there together. You recognize the cues together. You come back to normal together. Whatever stories you tell about what happened, spirits, ancestors, animal helpers, those stories reinforce that you're part of the same narrative. And that brings us to another function of sound, memory. Before writing, You don't have shopping lists, instruction manuals, or history books. Your archive lives in bodies and brains. You need ways to make important information sticky enough to survive the thousands of little accidents that can take a person out of the world. Rhythm and melody are incredible tools for that. Try reciting the alphabet without the tune you learned as a child. You probably can, but it feels wrong. The structure of the song is welded to the structure of the information. In an Iranian context, the alphabet might be sequences of place names, seasonal cues, hunting lore, kinship stories, or origin myths. We can easily imagine a storyteller speaking in a heightened, almost sung speech with a flute, shadowing the phrases or marking transitions between episodes. The person with the flute isn't just an entertainer, they're an educator and an archivist. When kids hear the same melody, every time the group talks about the dangerous crossing to the towns, those details are more likely to stick. When adults hear a familiar phrase and flute pairing attached to a story of betrayal or cooperation, they remember the moral as much as the plot. In this way, music fuses emotion and information. The parts of your brain that care about feeling safe, loved, included, are being engaged at the same time as the parts that track details. That's a powerful combination. If your long-term survival depends on shared knowledge, then there's the simple, underrated role of music in making life less unbearable. We tend to think of nightlife as neon signs and crowded clubs, but the core ingredients, darkness, gathered bodies, elevated mood, rhythmic sound, are much older than cities. Picture a midwinter night, supplies low, but not yet critical. No one is actively dying. There's anxiety in the air, but also a strange kind of release. The day's work is over. The predators are less active. The children are drifting towards sleep. This is the space where you can afford to celebrate. A flute line starts playful and fast. Other people add clapping or stomping. Someone starts a call and response song. Maybe there's dancing, circles, lines, jumping in place to keep warm. For a short while, hunger and cold are background noise. What's foreground is the joy of moving in step with other beating hearts. That joy isn't frivolous. It's glue. Groups that share intense positive experiences are more likely to cooperate when things turn bad again. It's a lot harder to abandon, steal from, or kill the people you've sung and danced with every winter since childhood. Those layers of shared memory create a thick web of obligation and affection from a cold, evolutionary perspective that looks suspiciously like a survival mechanism. And so this 30,000-year-old flute stops being an isolated curiosity. It becomes a tiny, very durable witness to something bigger, humans discovering and refining a technology of sound that could calm fear, organize grief, carry stories, and charge cold nights with meaning. In a world where any given day could bring injury, starvation, or a predator's teeth, those few hours around the fire, or in a resonant cave, wrapped in intentional sound, might have been some of the most valuable time a group ever spent. Because out of those gatherings came more than just songs. They came identities. They came myths. They came the deep emotional sense of we that can hold a community together through the next storm, the next migration, the next burial. And that, in the end, might be the most radical thing about the Holy Fells flute. It suggests that by 30,000 years ago, humans weren't just surviving together, they were feeling together on purpose, in patterns, using tools they built with their own hands. The next question is, what happens when that emotional technology meets everything else? Those Ice Age people were inventing art on cave walls, carved figurines, long-distance trade. Put those pieces side by side, and the flute stops sounding like a simple instrument, and start sounding like part of a much larger symphony of human culture. When archaeologists first pulled that fragile little tube of bone out of the sediments at Holy Fells, it didn't just add a line to a catalogue, it hit a nerve. Up to that point, a lot of public storytelling about cavemen still leaned on the same old clichés: grunting, brutal, sort of clever with rocks. but emotionally and creatively flat. The idea that people 30,000 or 40,000 years ago were capable of art and symbolism was already on fore, because of cave paintings and carvings. But music is harder to hand-wave away. You can argue endlessly about what a painted bison meant. You can debate whether a carved figure is a goddess, a toy, or a joke. But a flute with carefully spaced finger holes carved from a hollow bird bone is unambiguous. Someone long ago cared enough about sound to engineer it. That forced a shift. In academic circles, the Holy Fells flutes and their cousins nudged music from the nice extra category into the core human behavior column. If people are making instruments this sophisticated, this early, music probably isn't a late luxury. It's sitting right there with hunting tools, clothing, and fire as part of the basic survival package. In the wider culture, these finds quietly rewrote the mental image of Ice Age humans. News articles started showing reconstructions of early people, not just huddled grimly against the cold, but playing instruments. Children's books began to include scenes of prehistoric music making, alongside the mammoth hunts. The stereotype of the dull, unimaginative caveman had to make room for somebody who could shape bird bone into a device for producing scales. And then there's what the flute set in motion after it came out of the ground. Almost immediately, museums and experimental archaeologists started building replicas, not symbolic mock-ups, but playable instruments based on precise measurements of the originals. Researchers debated what tools would have been used to drill the holes without cracking the bone, how long it would take to carve one, whether the maker planned the hole spacing or adjusted it by ear. Musicians got involved. Some flautists trained on modern instruments began learning how to coax sound out of these awkward asymmetric replicas. They experimented with fingerings with breath pressure, with the way different caves and modern concert halls responded to those ancient pitches. Recordings appeared, albums where you can hear melodies played on reconstructions of the Holy Fells flute, sometimes accompanied by drums, voices, or other replica instruments. Those performances raised new questions. If this flute can play a pentatonic scale, a pattern of notes that also underlies a lot of traditional music from China to Scotland, does that say something about human auditory preferences? Is there a deep shared bias in how our brains like to organize pitch? Or is that an accident of which bone survived and which finger holes happen to be drilled? If an experienced modern music can get a wide range of sounds out of the instrument, what could someone who grew up with that flute from childhood do? Are we underestimating the virtuosity of Ice Age players? Because we're treating the flute as a fragile artifact instead of as a well-worn tool. And the more researchers tried to answer those questions, the more they realized how much the flute touches. Physicists started modeling airflow through the instrument to understand its acoustics. Cognitive scientists asked whether infants show preferences for intervals that match what these flutes can produce. Anthropologists revisited ethnographic records of small-scale societies that still use bone flutes today, looking for patterns in how those instruments fit into ritual storytelling and everyday play. Even the way museum exhibits are designed shifted. Instead of silent glass cases presenting tools as static dead things, some institutions began adding soundscapes, reconstructed flute music, playing softly as you walk past the display, or interactive stations where you can hear individual notes, breath noises, echoes. The flute encouraged curators to treat the Ice Age less like a gallery of objects and more like a lived, sounded environment. Underneath all of that, there's a deeper thread this little instrument forces us to confront: continuity. Take a step back from the specific debates about fingerings and scales, and you're left with a simple, stubborn fact. 30,000 years ago, a human being took breath, the same invisible, taken foreign-ted thing that keeps you alive right now, and decided it shouldn't just go in and out of lungs. It should come back out shaped, tuned, turned into something that could move other people. We haven't stopped doing that. We do it when we whistle absent-mindedly on a walk, when we belt out pop songs in a car, when a parent hums into the soft spot of a baby's hair to coax them to sleep, when a crowd sings at a concert or a game, and suddenly thousands of lungs are timing their exhales, together, across millennia, across continents, across unbelievable differences in technology and belief. That's one of the things that hasn't changed. Humans keep taking air and making it mean something. Sometimes the meaning is obvious, a warning shout, a spoken instruction. But often, as with a flute, the meaning is more slippery. It's how it feels in your chest when you hear a certain interval. It's the prickle on your skin when many voices lock into harmony. It's the way a simple melody can yank you back into a childhood memory before you even realize what's happening. The Holyfell's flute is one of the oldest physical proofs we have that this trick, this turning of breath into emotion, memory, and connection, was already part of our toolkit. When you listen to a reconstruction, you're not just hearing ancient music, you're hearing an early version of something you do every day without thinking. Since we're paused here, at this hinge point between Ice Age nights and our own, this is also a good place to mention something I'd been working on that dives deeper into exactly these kinds of stories. If you want more long-form journeys through deep time, more of this mix of archaeology, genetics, and imagination, there's a book available now at Sleepytime History Dokalongzatúthero. Thorins, it expands on episodes like this one, takes you through other turning points in human evolution and culture, and is designed to be something you can sink into slowly, night after night. There's a discount running this week, so if you've been curious or you'd like to support more research and storytelling like this, now's a good moment to check it out. Because what we're really circling around, with the flute, and with everything it connects to, is a question about us. If a tiny group of Ice Age humans, living through cold and scarcity we can barely imagine, chose to spend precious time and energy hollowing a bone, drilling holes, practicing breath and finger movements until they could bend air into melody, what does that say about what kind of animal we are? It suggests that creativity isn't frosting on the cake of survival. It's baked in, that the urge to make sound into pattern and pattern into meaning shows up as soon as our basic needs are even barely met. In the final stretch of this story, we're going to pull all these threads together: the genetics, the art, the social rituals, the competition with other human species, the quiet breath flowing through a piece of vulture bone. We'll ask what this 30,000-year-old instrument ultimately reveals about the way our minds work, and about what we might be underestimating in ourselves today. If we zoom out one last time and look at that flute, not as an isolated curiosity, but as a data point in the story of us, a few things stand out. First, the intentional craft. Whoever made it wasn't improvising with a random bone. They knew that hollow bird bones resonate differently than solid mammal bones. They knew how much force they could apply without cracking it. They understood, even if they would never have put it into words, that where you put a hole and how big you make it will change the sound. This isn't hit rock sharp now. It's engineering. It tells us that by 3,540,000 years ago, humans weren't just tinkering, they were planning. They were picturing an outcome that didn't exist yet, a particular range of notes, and working backward through a series of steps to get there. That means forward planning, motor control, a sense of cause and effect that extends beyond the immediate. If I poke this thing, I eat. Second, cultural learning. Nobody is born knowing where to drill the second finger hole on a griffin vulture ulna. That knowledge had to be taught, watched, repeated, corrected. Maybe you learned from a parent or an elder. Maybe you just hung around while instruments were being made and absorbed it slowly, the way you absorb the rhythm of your community's speech or the melodies of its songs. Either way, the flute points to an invisible structure around it, an apprenticeship of some kind, a line of transmission stretching back through generations of trial and error. That's culture in the strict anthropological sense. Not just stuff people do, but information stored outside of DNA, passed along through showing and telling, and that leads to the third big takeaway. Complex social worlds. You don't spend hours delicately shaping bone into an object that does nothing but make sound, unless the sound matters to someone. Not just to you alone, quietly in a corner, but to a group. The very existence of the flute suggests gatherings. It suggests moments where enough people are present and safe enough and fed enough that there's room for shared attention to something that isn't a fire, a predator, or a wound. Maybe it's a small circle, a family. Maybe it's multiple bands coming together at a seasonal meeting place, exchanging mates and obsidian and stories. Whatever the exact scene, it implies social complexity, expectations about who plays, who listens, when music is appropriate, what it means if a certain melody starts at dusk instead of dawn. So when we look at this one fragile relic, we're not just seeing they made music, we're seeing a package deal, advanced planning, teaching, and learning, and a social environment rich enough to give music a function. But right next to those strong conclusions sits some stubborn uncertainties. We can estimate how old the flute is, based on the layers and the radiocarbon dates from nearby organic material. Still, those dates usually come with ranges, not single exact years. 31,000 plus or minus a couple of thousand, 38,000 within a given confidence interval. Different labs, different calibration curves, slightly different answers. The instrument is unquestionably ancient, but when we say 30,000-year-old flute, that's shorthand for a blur of time, not a pin on a calendar. We can say it's Aurignacian, which usually means anatomically modern humans. But the exact attribution who carved this particular piece, whose hands wore the surface smooth, is harder to nail down than headlines sometimes admit. Neanderthals were in Europe not that long before. There are ongoing debates about whether some bone tubes with holes associated with their sites are flutes, chewed bones, or something else entirely. So when we assign the whole Fells flute to our lineage, we should remember that we're doing so against a background of overlapping species and shared genes. And then there's the melody problem. We can model airflow, measure hole spacing, reconstruct the likely scale. We can build replicas and give them to skilled players. But the specific tunes, the songs they sang while that flute played, the emotional associations attached to a rising or falling sequence of notes for those particular people, that part is gone. We can say, this instrument could play a pentatonic scale, but we can't say, and here is the lullaby they used to sing in late winter when the mammoth herds hadn't returned. The best we can do is bracket possibilities. It might have been used in rituals, in storytelling, in courtship, in simple play. Different researchers emphasize different scenarios based on analogies with modern foragers or on acoustics of caves. None of those reconstructions are certain. They're informed guesses in a way that mixture solid physical evidence wrapped in unresolvable questions is exactly what makes the flute powerful. So, before we leave it, imagine one more Ice Age night. The hunt is over for the day. The fire is banked low to stretch the fuel. Stars hang in an air so clear they feel close enough to touch. Around the circle are people whose faces, if you met them now in jeans and a t-shirt, you would recognize as fully human without a second thought. Someone lifts the flute. There's a brief shuffle as bodies settle. A baby fusses and is rocked closer to the warmth. A few older children lean forward, already knowing the first few notes, and silently fingering along. The first breath goes through bone, and the quiet breaks, not with a shout or an alarm, but with a line of sound deliberately shaped to move the minds around that fire. You know this scene, even though you don't know the melody, because versions of it are still happening in concert halls, on subway platforms, in bedrooms, with a single lamp burning and headphones on. That's why this artifact matters, not because it's exotic and distant, but because it collapses the distance. It forces us to rethink early humans, not as half-formed, almost us creatures, shuffling toward real culture, but as people already deeply entangled in art, teaching, ritual, and shared emotion. It asks whether we're underestimating the depth of minds that left so few traces, and whether we might also be underestimating what our own minds are capable of when survival isn't the only thing on the table. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where in the world you'd are listening from, and what part of this journey into deep time surprised you most. And if you'd like more explorations like this, more late-night walks through prehistory, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. If this kind of slow, immersive dive into the deep past is your thing, you might also enjoy the book I mentioned earlier. It gathers together more prehistoric secrets like this flute, stories about bottlenecks, vanished cousins, and the strange inventions that made us who we are. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you'd like to support this work over at sleepytimehistory.com. For now though, maybe just sit for a moment with the thought that somewhere in your own body there's the same breath, the same nervous system, the same hunger for pattern and connection that once moved through a piece of hollow bone in a dark cave 30,000 years ago, and that when you listen to music tonight, in whatever form it takes, you're participating in one of the oldest conversations our species has ever had. Heat, 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 heat.